Bibles with me this morning and turning them to Exodus chapter 10. Would you please stand with me as I read? I'll be reading verses 1 from chapter 10 all the way through verse 20 of chapter 10. Please follow along with me as I read. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord." So Moses and Aaron went in to Pharaoh and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country, eat every tree of yours that grows in the field, and they shall fill your houses and the houses of all your servants and of all the Egyptians, as neither your father nor your grandfathers have seen, from the day they came on the earth to this day." Then he turned and went out from Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh's servants said to him, "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, so that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, "Go, serve the Lord your God, but which ones are to go?" Moses said, "We will go with our young and our old. We will go with our sons and daughters, and with our flocks and herds, for we must hold a feast to the Lord." But he said to them, "The Lord be with you if I ever let you and your little ones go. Look, you have some evil purpose in mind. No, go, the men among you, and serve the Lord, for that is what you are asking." And they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, so that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat every plant in the land, all that the hail has left." So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts came up over all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor ever will be again. They covered the face of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh hastily called Moses and Aaron and said, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now therefore forgive my sin, please, only this once, and plead with the Lord your God only to remove this death from me." So he went out from Pharaoh and pleaded with the Lord. And the Lord turned the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them into. May the Lord add his blessing this morning to the reading of his word. You may be seated. I want to begin this morning by stating 4 observations regarding the design of the plagues. 4 observations regarding the design of the plagues, particularly their severity, their geography, the foreshadowing, and their logic. Severity, geography, foreshadowing, and the logic of the design of the plagues. What that means is that each set of plagues came in a set of 3, 3, 3, 1. So the 10th plague is totally isolated unto itself. much like the seventh day of creation is isolated unto itself. It's set apart. It's unique in that way. We're in the third triad. We're now in the second of the three in that third triad. What I discussed last week with the hail is that God, in introducing the third triad and starting with the hail, said essentially to Pharaoh, you will now feel the full weight or the full force of my plagues. In other words, the previous 6 plagues were pulled punches. They didn't actually deliver the full weight that I could have given them. Could have obliterated you and the Egyptians from this planet, but I've held back so that I can get to the final culmination of the plagues where you will feel the full weight of who I am and what I'm capable of. So we sense in these 3 plagues before the 10th that they are incredibly severe. It's in the last plague, the plague of the hail, that the first time human death is introduced to the equation. That if you don't remove your servants from the field, they will die. So death is now on the scene in the full force of these final 3 of the triad. We see Pharaoh himself in this plague say, remove this death from me. East wind in Genesis. And now we see this east wind introduced again. This time it's bringing locusts. And Pharaoh says, listen, we will die. This is death. Remove it from me. You remember that when the hail came, it left the wheat and the emmer, which was still low enough and tiny enough that it wouldn't have been destroyed by the hail. What was affected in the hail, interestingly, was barley. Barley was used by Egypt to make beer, lots of it. As if to say, Egypt, listen up. This is going to be a sobering event. But now the wheat and the emmer, which were yet viable after the hail, will disappear. Starvation is now on the scene. Death is looming. Just want to read to you so that you might get the feel of what it must have been like as the locusts came into Egypt on this east wind. This is from Laura Ingalls Wilder. In her journal, her memoir, she writes about life on the Minnesota prairie. And listen to how she describes a plague of locusts coming into Minnesota. Plunk, she writes. Something hit Laura's head and fell to the ground. She looked down and saw the largest grasshopper she'd ever seen. Then huge brown grasshoppers were hitting the ground all around her, hitting her head and her face and her arms. They came thudding down like hail. The cloud was hailing grasshoppers. The cloud was grasshoppers. Their bodies hid the sun and made darkness. Their thin, large wings gleamed and glittered. The rasping whirring of their wings filled the whole air, and they hit the ground and the house with the noise of a hailstorm. Laura tried to beat them off. Their claws clung to her skin and her dress. They looked at her with bulging eyes, turning their heads this way and that. Mary ran screaming into the house. Grasshoppers covered the ground. There was not one bare bit to step on. Laura had to step on grasshoppers, and they smashed, squirming and slimy under her feet. Grasshoppers beat down from the sky and swarmed thick over the ground. Their long wings were folded, and their strong legs took them hopping everywhere. The air whirred, and the roof went on sounding like the roof in a hailstorm. Then Laura heard another sound. One big sound of many tiny nips and snips and gnawings. The grasshoppers were eating. You could hear the millions of jaws biting and chewing. Day after day, the grasshoppers kept on eating. They ate all the wheat and the oats. They ate every green thing, all the garden and all the prairie grass. The whole prairie was bare and brown. Millions of brown grasshoppers whirred low over it. Not a green thing was in sight anywhere. Just to give you a picture of that devastation. This is the severity of the plagues as they're moving in upon Egypt. And of course, there's application here. I want you to understand, I want you to think in the mind of an Egyptian, let alone Pharaoh and his servants. I want you to see that in Egypt, in idolatristic Egyptian life, God is weighing in on the Egyptians. And as He weighs in on the Egyptians, His wrath is growing and growing and growing. And the consequences of their continued rebellion is taking its toll. I want you to see that God is inviting Egypt to repent. It's there. He gives them the option in the plague of the hail. Anyone who is ready to listen to me, regard me above the gods of the sky, above the gods of the atmosphere and the weather systems, above those gods, any Egyptian that's ready to respect my word and my character, you bring your servants in from the land, from the fields. You bring in your animals, protect them, and you'll be spared. That's an invitation. He doesn't have to do that. You notice that in this plague, Moses and Aaron leave. Pharaoh calls them back and he puts some big threat on them. He barks in their face and then sends them out as if they don't have a time to respond. And he thinks, well, maybe they left on my terms. Maybe they'll keep my terms. But of course, God is no respecter of persons, and the plague comes like God threatened. But He's inviting Egypt into a belief system. This is why the option is there when the 10th plague comes that you could take the blood of the lamb and put it over your door, and the death angel will pass by, whether you're an Egyptian household or an Israelite household. It's there. It's an option to enter into belief. My point is that the world, and I believe as Christians, when we involve ourselves in sin, the consequences are growing for that sin. And we should see, as the writing of the wall, something is badly brewing here if I don't curb it. If I don't nip it in the bud, something is growing here. I'm starting to see signs of what will eventually come about in my life or the life of my kids or the life of my family if I don't curb whatever it is. My attitude, my addictions, my idols. If I don't curb these, they're going to get out of hand. The stakes are getting higher and higher and higher, and worse thing upon worse thing upon worse thing is happening. So I need to wake up. C.S. Lewis, I've described to you before, talks about the sin of grumbling, and he says that after a while, as it starts, you're distinct from the grumbling. You can even criticize the fact that you grumble. But pretty soon, that line where I'm a grumbling person to I'm a grumbler begins to get blurred. I'm a person that grumbles, or I'm a grumbler. It gets blurred. And he says, pretty soon, you're just like a machine. You grumble. You're not even able to separate yourself from it. And as it escalates, hell then becomes the final result. There's been glimmers of hell all along, but then you're eventually there. The road to hell, C.S. Lewis points out, the most dangerous road to hell is one that's subtle, without many signposts along the way. This is the road that Pharaoh is on, and many of the Egyptians. So that's the severity that we should see in the world, the severity of God's judgment befalling, and we can even see it in our own lives to a degree if we have eyes to see. That's the severity of the plagues. It's getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and every time is a wake-up call. And God makes it easy. He gives them a season with no beer, makes it very easy to sober up, if anyone had the eyes and ears to take it. Second, the geography. The geography. What we've seen in the plagues, now that we're in the 8th, is that it has spread. God's jurisdiction has spread. It started in the water. It went out onto the land with the frogs coming out of the Nile. And then the gnats themselves come up from the dust in the land. So you're getting water, you're getting land. Now the gnats are in the sky. Then you've got flies. Now it's getting on you in an in-your-face sort of a way with the boils. But it's entering into the sky. So what you have is you have water, land, and now sky. You've got the east wind. You've got hail and lightning. And then you've got darkness, which is, of course, the result of what God does to the sun. The point here is that everyone understood the universe in 3 realms: earth, water below, heavens above. And now God has demonstrated mastery over every single realm of the universe. Consider the words of Alistair Roberts and Andrew Wilson. They write this in their book, Echoes of Exodus. If the ancient world were a 3-story house, the earth, the waters beneath, and the heavens above, God brought destruction to each story and humiliated the deities that governed each story level of the house. The Egyptian gods were ferreted out and removed from the house like a pest or an infestation, from cellar to rafter. God is clearing the universe of all the ancient gods and goddesses so that He alone is Lord of the house, Lord of the universe. That's what God's doing right now. And friends, this is exactly what God's doing right here and right now. God is in the process, in the nation, in the world, in our lives, of establishing Himself as God in every area, in every realm. That's what He's about right now. It's what He's doing in your life, in our nation's life, and in our world's life. For those who have eyes and ears to receive it. Third, I want to talk about the foreshadowing that takes place in the 8th plague. The foreshadowing. In other words, it's a typification. You get little glimmers here of what's to come. First, the locusts come on the land by an east wind. It will be the east wind that God sends to part the Red Sea as the Israelites leave Egypt. You see, for someone who has eyes and ears to receive what God's doing, they say, man, I hear the locusts, I see the locusts, but what really blows my mind is the God of the locusts that's able to do this. Because if He's able to do this, for crying out loud, He could part the whole ocean if He wanted to with a wind. You see, that is taking the current circumstances and rising above the freaking out of the locust coming and you might die as a result. It's actually taking it a step above and saying,
I'm going to top tier with this. I'm not going to receive it like the world is frantically. I'm going to look at it deeper. Of course, God will part the Red Sea with the east wind. We see that foreshadowed in this plague. Beyond that, we see that the locusts meet their demise in the Red Sea. They're driven by the east wind into the Red Sea. Well, guess who else meets their demise in the Red Sea? The Egyptian army. In fact, the same phrase is used of each. Not one survived. All the locusts are done. All the Egyptian army is done. But there's more foreshadowing. You see that Pharaoh in this plague says, remove this death from me. Of course, that's a foreshadowing of the fact that if Pharaoh does not change, if the Egyptians do not change, there will be a death in each home, namely the firstborn son. And then finally, you see darkness, the darkness that will come in the 9th plague, foreshadowed here, because when the locusts come in, they cover the ground, and it says the ground was darkened. Couldn't see it for sake of the locusts. Peter points this out then after pointing these 4 foreshadowing effects out of this plague. I quote, we see then the final 3 mighty acts of God, all anticipated in the plague of the locusts. The darkness to come, the death of the firstborn, and the parting of the Red Sea with the loss of the Egyptian army. Of course, there's application here. That as God ministers to the world and as God ministers to us, there is a foreshadowing, again, of what's to come if we don't take Him and our lives seriously. There are signs. And I trust that if you have dear brothers and sisters in your lives, you could ask them, do you see a trajectory in my life for good or for ill? And if they love you and they're faithful friends, they will wound you. But they'll be faithful wounds. And they'll say, yeah, I see certain trajectories. This, that, and the other thing. They're common. They're common characteristics in your life that make you unhappy and everybody else around you unhappy. Foreshadowings of what's to come. God is good in this way. And then the last of our 4 observations of the design of the plagues is the logic of this plague. The logic of this plague and these coming to follow. As you get into the 8th, 9th, and 10th plague, you have something in common with each. That would have been a good Connect Group question. Read these next 3 accounts and find the common denominator. But I didn't, so I'm going to give you the answer. Darkness. Darkness connects this, the next, and the next. The land is dark because of the locusts. The 9th plague will be darkness so thick you can feel it for 3 days, no less. And then the final plague, the 10th, will happen in the night when the death angel comes and visits each household. So, what's the point? With darkness coming in the last 3 plagues. Well, here's the point. I've tried to be faithful all the way through these plagues to point out, whenever the narrator includes it, hints back to Genesis 1, to the creation narrative. Because what God is doing in the 10 plagues is He's committing decreation. He's undoing the creation order. He makes hints at it all the while. Creation is being turned on its head. And now in these final 3 plagues, God has faithfully escorted us back to what? the very beginning of creation, namely when what? Darkness was everywhere. Darkness. In other words, the point is, for the faithful reader and exegete, is to say this: God is actually taking creation back to its complete beginning. In other words, He is willing to turn creation on its head to bring about what He initially planned for in the creation mandate. In other words, Pharaoh, because you are exalting yourself as the center, I will rip apart the entire earth to put it back in proper working order, namely with who at the center? God. Just consider the words of Jesus. It is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. We're seeing that played out right now in the plagues. God is tearing creation apart at the seams in order to not let His intent in the law go void. And His intent in the law is that the knowledge of God would cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. That's His point. That's his end game for creation. That the world would be covered with His images. Pharaoh's getting in the way of that. And so God is unleashing the plagues, tearing creation apart at its seams to bring that about. That's the logic of the plagues. He has brought everybody, the whole earth, back to the beginning of creation where darkness was everywhere. There's no deep. There's no darkness over the surface of the deep because God said, I already did that. I already flooded the earth and I won't do it again. But essentially, He's doing something very similar to what He did in the flood because the flood was going back to the beginning of creation. Now He's doing that with Pharaoh. He's turning off the lights. He's making the vegetation disappear. So you're getting to see the earth like it was before He did any of those things. It's dark and it's bare. And this is the world that we carve out without God. And so this, of course, is the incrimination upon our nation, who is running at warp speed to carve out a nation that is without God. And you will see creation, our nation, languish as long as it continues on that course. But this is what He's also doing with you and me. If we were to take out a little sheet of paper this morning and we were to write everything that we'd like to see changed, everything that we would say is going wrong or not as it should be in our lives, we need to recognize that God is at work rattling our little personal worlds to bring about what He's seeking to bring about in Egypt and in the world. So whatever you'd like to change right now, or this afternoon, or this evening, or tomorrow, or next year, God has it there to bring about a relationship with you. A relationship with me. He upends our lives to escort us into His heart. That's the deal. Listen to the words from Roberts and Wilson. Escaping Egypt is only the first half of Exodus. It is easy for us to forget this. In an age where freedom, catch this, is understood as merely being free from oppression, from constraint, or whatever. This aspect of liberation, as wonderful as it is only half the deal. In the Scriptures, more emphasis is placed on the freedom for versus the freedom from. for worship, for flourishing, for growth in obedience and joy and glory. Human beings are not designed to be free from all constraint. Slaves to nothing but their own passions. This is how the entirety of our nation looks at retirement, frankly. Triumphantly enthroned as our own masters, even our own gods. But everybody serves somebody. So, the point of the Exodus is not just for Israel to find deliverance from serving the old master. The point of Exodus is for them to find delight in serving the new one. See? Then they go on. Freedom from serving Pharaoh is the easy bit. From beginning to end, it only takes 14 chapters. Freedom to serve God, on the other hand, takes 40 years of wandering and the next 4 books of the Pentateuch. And I would argue, takes the death of God's own Son. See, freedom from is easy. Freedom for, that's a whole different deal. And friends, it's true with us. In coming to Christ, you might have become free from addiction. In coming to Christ, you might have your habits cleaned up. That's freedom from. You might not swear like you used to. You might not lie or steal like you used to. From an external standpoint, you might be much cleaner than you were before. But what about the freedom for part? The freedom to be all in, time-wise, financially. That's another thing. And of course, those things can be external as well. But this is the deal. Our hearts are deadly, they're diseased, they're destructive. That's the nature of our hearts. And God's work right now is to trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. This is our job. To have this active, pulsating relationship with God that's intimate. It's unique, set apart from all else, and influencing all else. Something that brings about a change in our deepest character, not our surface character. This is what only God alone can do. God handles all the external components. He did that with the flood, and Noah's second action was getting drunk and laying naked. He's doing that with Egypt for Israel and for the world. And Israel will leave this incredible experience and get taken into the wilderness for 40 years to be taught what they didn't learn. So the external components are the easy part. A changed heart, a changed behavior, that is the hard part, where God has to really dig in to the place of His own Son. 2 options, 2 paths, as it were. And I want to talk about those in wrapping things up. The first path is the path of Pharaoh. The second path is the path of Israel for those who took it. Let's talk about Israel first. So the first interpretation of the plagues, if you take the design of the plagues and take them in their proper working order, we looked last week at how far the design of the plagues was meant to go. Last week's plague was very intentional in telling us how far God wanted the plague of hail to go. Verse 14 of chapter 9, that you may know that there's none like me in all the earth. Verse 16, for this purpose I've raised you up to show you my power, so that my name might be proclaimed throughout the earth, in all the earth. Verse 29, the thunder will cease, there will be no more hail, so that you may know. That's the distance he wants it to go. But in the plague of the locust, he tells you the way he wants it to be transmitted. So in the plague of the hail, he tells you how far he wants it to go. In the plague of the locust, he tells you how he wants it to get that far. And the way he describes how the design of the plagues is meant to be transmitted is through families. Specifically, fathers and mothers, grandfathers, grandmothers. That's how he wants it to get to the ends of the earth, through family transmission. You notice an emphasis on the family in the text this morning. When Pharaoh gets his arm twisted behind his back with his servants, really humiliating him, and says, Pharaoh, how long are you going to take this thing out? So he calls Moses and Aaron back in, and he says, okay, how many of you want to go? Moses and Aaron's answer is incredibly proficient. So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, and he said to them, go and serve the Lord your God. But which ones are to go? Moses said, we will go with our young and our old. We will go with our sons and daughters and with our flocks and herds. In other words, it's an all-encompassing answer. Pharaoh, if you think I'm going to bargain with you, I don't have to. We all want to go, every single one of us, and our animals. Of course, what Pharaoh was wanting is for the men to go, leaving their wives and children there, basically held hostage so they'd return. So he's bargaining again. Moses is having none of it. But you see the presence of the family. We want everybody there. We want everybody together. That's what we want. That's what God wants. But you also see the presence of the family in the beginning of the passage this morning. God gives the intent of how he wants this story to get told. Then the Lord said to Moses, verse 1 and 2, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly. And that harshly is a poor translation. It can mean sportingly. How I've made fools of. It can even be so drastic as that. It's probably how I've made sport of the Egyptians. In other words, it didn't even come close to touching what I could do. And what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. So how does the message get to the ends of the earth? Through you telling your children about it. And your children's children. So the Hebrew literally says, in the hearing of your son and your son's son. In other words, this is a job for parents and for grandparents. Because we don't have the assistance of Awana, Sunday classes, children's church. And in my estimation, this is a very good thing for us to experience. Because it forces the responsibility where the responsibility is first. You see, these things, Awana, Sunday classes, children's church, youth, we're able to have youth group, but all these other things, these are supplements, but they can very easily become the substance. They're supplements. You go to a Christian school, whatever, it's a supplement. It's not the substance. These are add-ons. They're not the heart of the matter. And specifically, I want to talk to dads, because in Deuteronomy, right now they have the whole family go out as God wanted, but in Deuteronomy, 3 times a year, they would hold a sacred assembly, and it was the men who were required to go. Often they'd bring their families, bring their wives, but it was the men that had to be there. 3 times a year, a sacred assembly, generally for a week or less. See, it's the men who were to be like the cherubim in the standing by, and let it be coming into his house, into the first temple of Eden. But he didn't. So the cherubim takes his place now to keep him out. But I want to get right to the heart of the matter. It's important that you come to church. It's important that you yourself have personal devotions. It's important that you pray personally. It's important that you lead in prayer. Whether that's just saying we're going to pray, I'd like you to pray, or whoever the case is, but you're leading. It's important to have family devotions. This is our job, it's our responsibility to take up the lead in this way. But I want to go even further than that. It's not just imparting knowledge that's the point. It's not the point. That's important. It's necessary. You have to do it. It's commanded. But it's more than that. What we are to transmit into our families and into our circles if we don't have father, wife, children, family, as singles, as single moms, as single dads. What we are meant to communicate. A single mom has to fulfill the role as the dad. That's her situation, so she needs to fulfill that role. Singles need to fulfill that role in the networks God's given them. But what's the point? Where's the end? The end is not an imparting of knowledge. That's not the end. That's the means to the end. The end is worship through a changed heart, changed by Jesus Christ. I want to get very honest with you this morning. It might just be possible before God that my kids have gotten the best picture of my ugliness during family devotions. Is that crazy? You got this situation where you have the most important thing on planet Earth for eternity to tell your kids. There's nothing more important than this. No school assignment, no political situation, no war going on is more important than giving spiritual truth about God to your kids. There's nothing more important. So you have this urgency on your heart and your mind as you're seeking to communicate these truths. You, of course, only have a limited time to do it. And so what happens as I do that? Let me get very specific. Kids get antsy. Conversations start off on a tangent. The younger ones interrupt with too many questions, so the older ones get bored. Someone spills a drink. Someone wants a drink. Someone has to go to the bathroom. I might not be pleased with how Becky's corralling or not corralling Abe and Esther. These are all sorts of things. And you've got this crazy urgency to get this truth through, and it's all backfiring. And I probably feel too much weight to save my kids. It's God's job primarily. And so I lose my cool at the kids, or I lose my cool with Becky. And then I have to finish the devotion. Doug Wilson cut me to the inner core. He's one of Pastor Alex and I's favorite pastors. And he talks about the principle from the Old Testament, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. It's a sick thought to boil a kid in its mother's milk. But he summarizes the point or the principle behind that condemnation of God, and he says this: that which is intended by God to be the means of life, namely the milk for the baby, kid, that which is intended by God to be the means of life must not be perverted into the instrument of death. Milk brings life. Don't make it a form of death. Devotions bring life. Don't make it a form of death. And unfortunately, several of my family devotions has been a form of death, actually. Necessary to do, but it needs to be done in faith. That can dance with the spilled drink. That can dance with whatever situation is not going quite the way I want it to go. It can move with that because God is God. And I can respond in patience, grace, and love. But when I don't, it's a sign that I'm looking at this devotion as resting totally on me and its success as far as I determine success. So the answer isn't, although I felt it sometimes, why do I even do this? That's not the answer. The answer is, Ben, have you heard about patience? Ben, have you heard the word self-control? Have you heard love? Have you heard about forgiveness? These are all fruits of the Holy Spirit, which you're not evidencing right now. And because of that, you're turning a source of life and perverting it into a source of death. Maybe you need to take a break for a while. He starts by saying, a quote by John Wesley, let me read it. Orthodoxy or right opinion is at best a very slender part of religion. Who would say such things? Orthodoxy or right opinion is at best a very slender part of religion. Though right tempers cannot subsist without right opinions, yet right opinions may subsist without right tempers. There may be a right opinion of God without either love or one right temper toward Him. Satan is a proof of this. Then he goes on. This is Tozer now. Thanks to our splendid Bible societies and to other effective agencies for the dissemination of the Word, there are today many millions of people who hold right opinions, probably more than ever before in the history of the church. Yet I wonder if there was ever a time when true spiritual worship was at a lower ebb. To great sections of the church, the art of worship has been lost entirely, and in its place has come that strange and foreign thing called the program. This word has been borrowed from the stage and applied with sad wisdom to the type of public service which now passes for worship among us. Sound Bible exposition may be carried on in such a way as to leave the hearers devoid of any true spiritual nourishment whatever. For it is not mere words that nourish the soul, but God Himself. And unless and until the hearers find God in personal experience, they are not better for having heard the truth. The Bible is not an end in itself, but a means to bring men to an intimate and satisfying knowledge of God, that they may enter into Him, that they may delight in His presence, may taste and know the inner sweetness of the very God Himself in the core and center of their hearts. Friends, this is the point of Bible exposition. This is the point of personal devotions. This is the point of the Exodus. To not just transmit the story of God in a mechanical sort of way, but to tell it from the heart. In a heart that's owned by God. Let me finish by talking about Pharaoh. It's easy to look at Pharaoh and to see his hardened heart as an isolated case in the Bible. But it's not. We see that with Pharaoh, God puts his hard heart on like a brick on the accelerator to let it go wherever hard hearts go. But we find in Deuteronomy 28, when God is warning Israel, if you turn from me, here's what I'll do. If you stay with me, here's what I'll do. But if you turn from me, here's what I'll do. And one of the things he gives them is a confused mind. A madness, he even says. In other words, if you turn your hearts from me, a result, a repercussion, a judgment upon you will give you a mind that keeps doing those crazy things. Hosea 4 says that a people that turn from God will be a people without understanding and will come to ruin. We see Saul is given an evil spirit. Romans 1, Paul explains that the people in the past, because they refused to give thanks to God, were given a depraved mind. Paul will speak of the world as being darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of heart. They have become callous. So we need to stop thinking of Pharaoh as totally isolated, because he's not. The world is filled with hard hearts. And the reason I tell you this is because we need to stop thinking it's in our power to change people and recognize that it's in God's alone, which makes us people of prayer. Period. Yes, we speak truth in love. We speak it with gentleness and respect, but it's not on us. This is the deal. And when their hearts turn, what do they turn toward? Right knowledge? Yes, right knowledge. But to what end? A walking, talking, trust relationship with God through Jesus Christ. That's the point of the relationship with God. That trusts God to change those around us as we minister in His love, grace, patience, peace, kindness, goodness, joy, and self-control. And only the Spirit can bring that about. So, slow down. So, maybe don't turn on the TV. So, turn off the radio. So, turn your hearts to God so that He can change them, so that you can be shining as stars in a crooked and perverse generation. I'll ask the musicians to come.